What's actually safe but people think is dangerous. I booked the flight because it was faster, cheaper, and everyone kept repeating the same sentence. Flying is safer than driving. I believed the numbers right up until the cabin door sealed with that final metallic click. The moment the engine spooled, my brain stopped listening to facts and started looking for exits that didn't exist. At takeoff, my stomach lifted like it was trying to climb out of me. I gripped the armrests and watched the wing through the tiny oval window, half expecting it to snap the first time the plane tilted. When turbulence hit, the seatbelt sign chimed and the plane began to jolt. The man across the aisle smiled and kept reading. The flight attendant walked like she'd done it 1,000 times, which only made it stranger. How could they look calm while the floor kept dropping an inch at a time? Then the pilot's voice came on, steady, casual, explaining that the bumps were just wind currents, not danger. I forced myself to stare at the wing again. It flexed, yes, but it flexed the way a bridge does under traffic, built to bend instead of break. I remembered a video I'd once seen of stress tests where wings were pushed upward until they arched at a ridiculous angle and still held. The fear didn't vanish, but it shrank. The real suspense wasn't whether the plane would fall apart. It was whether I could keep my body from panicking long enough for my mind to catch up with reality. Next story. For most of my adult life, magnets felt like tiny threats disguised as souvenirs. I kept them away from my laptop, my phone, even my headphones. If a fridge magnet stuck to a metal desk leg near my bag, I'd peel it off like it was a live wire. The fear came from old warnings, stories about erased disks, ruined drives, one careless second wiping years of work. The night I finally tested that fear, it wasn't on purpose. I was packing up after a long day, tired and distracted, when a heavy magnetic name badge snapped onto the side of my work bag with a sharp clack. Inside that bag was an external hard drive holding the only copy of my thesis draft and months of client photos. I didn't notice until I got home. I froze in the hallway, bag half unzipped, thinking about invisible damage already done. My mind ran through every worst-case scenario. Corrupted files, spinning platters scratched, the kind of loss you can't explain without sounding irresponsible. I set the bag down like it might explode and peeled the badge off with slow fingers. Nothing happened. No sparks. No dramatic failure. When I finally plugged the drive in, the familiar light blinked and the folders opened as if my panic had been a separate reality. Later, I learned why the old fear existed. Magnetic storage, moving parts, the vulnerability of older media, and why modern devices don't flinch at small magnets the way they used to. But the suspense I felt in that hallway taught me something else. Sometimes the danger isn't the magnet. It's the outdated story that keeps controlling your hands. Next story. The pre-op nurse asked if I had any questions, and I heard myself say the one I'd been embarrassed to ask out loud. Is that safe? I nodded toward the medication list, eyes snagging on a name I'd only ever heard in headlines and whispered warnings. The word carried an instant image. Sirens, overdoses, tragedy. Nothing like a calm hospital room with warm blankets and soft beeping monitors. The anesthetist didn't flinch. He didn't lecture either. He simply explained what he was doing as he checked my IV, each step measured, practiced, boring in the way true safety often is. Still, when the syringe appeared, my pulse jumped. My mind insisted that danger could seep through my skin just by being near it. Then the drug went in, controlled, tiny, deliberate, and the world didn't tilt into chaos. My breathing stayed steady. The ceiling lights didn't smear. The monitor kept its calm rhythm. What I felt instead was the strange relief of realizing that dangerous isn't a property of a substance so much as a property of context. The dose, the setting, the training, the backup plan waiting if anything goes wrong. As I drifted, I heard the anesthetist talking to the nurse about routine things like groceries. That ordinary conversation was the most suspense-breaking sound imaginable. When I woke up later, my fear felt almost theatrical, like I'd brought a horror movie into a place designed for precision. The scariest part wasn't the medication. It was how easily my brain had mistaken a controlled tool for a monster. I was already losing the fight with my own lungs when the argument started. Pneumonia had turned every breath into work, and severe sepsis made the room feel far away, like I was watching my life through fogged glass. On my chart, the allergy list looked ridiculous, so long it practically accused me of being dramatic. I could see it in the doctor's eyes, the polite doubt, the quiet decision that anxiety explained everything. She spoke gently, explaining that the reaction I remembered was probably psychosomatic, itching and nausea, the same sensations people mistake for allergy all the time. She pointed out other medications I'd reacted to and suggested it might have been fillers in pills, not the drug itself. I was weak and tired of being disbelieved, so when she said she'd give a dose small enough for an infant, I let myself get persuaded. 30 seconds after the injection, every alarm bell inside my body screamed at once. My skin prickled like it was being swarmed, my throat tightened, and the monitor behind me started singing its sharp, urgent song. The doctor's face went pale. She blurted, "Oh, oh no," and then called for help that arrived instantly, as if the room had been waiting for this. The cruel part was the timing. I was in that bed trying not to die from the reason I'd come in, and suddenly I had to survive an extra emergency I didn't ask for, one that could have been avoided if anyone had believed me. Hours later, when the ICU finally had space, I stared at the ceiling and promised myself I'd never again treat my own lived experience as negotiable. Next story. When the office upgraded its network, the rumor arrived faster than the hardware. Over coffee, a colleague leaned in and said the words like a warning. "This 5G stuff is going to give everyone cancer." He wasn't a stranger to technology. We all worked in enterprise IT, so the certainty in his voice made the room feel suddenly unsafe, like the air itself had changed. I didn't want an argument. I just wanted him to hear himself. So I asked one question calmly. If 5G were truly dangerous in the way he meant, wouldn't it have to be ionizing? Wouldn't it have to have enough energy to break bonds, to damage cells? And if that band sits below visible light on the spectrum, what does that imply about the lights above our heads? His smile slipped, replaced by the kind of stillness you see right before someone realizes they've been standing on the wrong side of their own logic. For a second, the office went quiet, not because anyone was afraid of radiation, but because everyone felt that tiny suspenseful pause where a belief either collapses or gets defended at all costs. He glanced up at the ceiling panels, then at his phone in his hand, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. It was almost funny, but it was also strangely tense, because you could see the mental math happening in real time. If this is true, then that must be true too, and suddenly a simple fear has nowhere left to hide. No one clapped, no one mocked him. The moment passed and people went back to work. But later, I watched him step outside to take a call, and he did it without the old certainty. The building hadn't changed, only the story in his head had next story. On Halloween, my neighborhood turned into a moving lantern parade, porch lights glowing, costumes rushing from door to door, candy bags getting heavier with every block. The only thing heavier was the fear that always followed the night, the same old warning from adults, whispered like folklore. Check every wrapper, watch for poison, watch for needles, watch for free drugs. When I was a teenager, I helped hand out candy while my parents were away, and one of my friends dared me to throw a tiny drug baggie into the bowl, a harmless pinch of powdered sugar tied off in plastic. It was stupid and cruel, meant as a joke. By the end of the night, it was gone. I remember staring at the empty bowl, realizing I'd probably given someone's mother a story she would repeat for the next 20 years as proof the danger was real. Later, I learned the truth that never gets the same airtime. The rare documented tragedy wasn't a stranger poisoning candy. It was a father who poisoned his own child for an insurance payout. The myth survives because it feels like the kind of evil that could be hiding in the dark. But the real suspense that night wasn't in the candy. It was at the curb. Cars rolled through intersections too fast, headlights washing over kids who couldn't see above parked SUVs. I watched a toddler in a dinosaur suit step off the sidewalk without looking, and my whole body lunged forward before my brain formed a sentence. We kept scanning for poisoned sweets while the most common danger idled right beside us, impatient, familiar, and loud. Next story. As a kid, I swallowed chewing gum once and spent a week convinced I'd made a 7-year mistake. Adults treated it like a countdown had started inside my stomach. The fear stuck with me longer than the gum ever did. Even as an adult, I'd catch myself chewing carefully, thinking about that old warning, like my body was a storage unit that never threw anything away. Years later, the myth resurfaced in the strangest place, a pre-procedure appointment for a colonoscopy. While signing papers and pretending not to be nervous, I asked the doctor the question I'd carried since childhood. "Do you actually find gum in there?" He didn't even pause. In all his years, he said, he'd never found a wad of gum lodged like a time capsule. What he did find, constantly, was unchewed corn, bright, stubborn, and somehow perfectly intact. That answer did two things at once. It diffused the gum panic and it replaced it with a different kind of suspense, the unsettling realization that your body keeps receipts, just not the ones you expect. Later, at home, I opened my fridge and stared at a container of leftover corn like it had developed a secret personality. The next time someone repeated the 7 years line, I didn't argue. I just remembered the doctor's easy certainty and the quiet humor of it. The scary part wasn't swallowing gum. The scary part was how confidently we carry wrong facts, generation after generation, like they're family heirlooms. And somewhere in a clinic, a doctor is still seeing corn prove that point every single day. Next story. The first time I watched someone wash raw chicken, I thought the faucet was going to start a crime scene. He plopped the pieces into the sink, turned the water on full blast, and started rubbing like he was polishing a car. Droplets jumped onto the counter, the sponge, the dish rack, every surface people later touch without thinking. He looked proud, as if he'd just made the meat cleaner. Dinner was supposed to be simple. Instead, the kitchen turned tense. Nobody wanted to sound dramatic, but everyone's eyes kept tracking the invisible splash zone. A friend quietly moved the salad bowl farther away. Someone else wiped the counter and then froze, realizing the cloth was now part of the problem. The air felt like suspense, like we were waiting to see who would get sick first. What made it worse was the way fear takes over when people talk about chicken. Some act like it's a biohazard no matter what you do. Others act like nothing matters at all. The truth lives in the boring middle. Chicken isn't a monster if you handle it like an adult. Keep it contained, don't spread raw juices everywhere, and cook it properly. When the meal finally hit the table, everyone ate, but the conversation stayed on the kitchen. The real lesson wasn't that chicken is dangerous. It was that panic and carelessness look almost identical from a distance. The difference is what you do with your hands. That night, nobody got sick. The suspense ended without a twist, but I've never forgotten the sound of that faucet and how easily being careful can become the very thing that spreads the risk. Next story, I thought the scariest part of air travel was turbulence, until I heard the story from someone who worked behind the scenes. It started as casual conversation until he said you'd be surprised how often a plane isn't fueled the way everyone assumes it is. He explained how it's supposed to work. Fuel scheduled hours before the crew even arrives. Paperwork filed, numbers checked, weight and balance submitted. A chain of redundancies that turns "did we do it" into "we verified it." The suspense creeps in where humans creep in. When fueling is done in-house, it's baked into the checklist culture. When it's outsourced to contractors, life happens. Someone calls in sick, someone oversleeps, someone fuels the wrong aircraft, and nobody wants to admit the mistake. Imagine the crew walking in with the calm confidence of routine, believing the tank is full because it always is. Imagine the pilot slipping into the bad habit of not checking because the system handles it. Then imagine the moment the numbers don't match, the paperwork refusing to agree with reality. That mismatch is the kind of small, bureaucratic glitch that can save lives. In his telling, the near misses get caught before takeoff precisely because the procedure demands proof. No heroics, no last-second radio call, just a form that doesn't reconcile and a person who insists on fixing it before anyone leaves the ground. It made me think differently about safety. The plane isn't safe because nothing can go wrong. It's safe because it assumes something will and builds a net out of boring, repetitive checks. The suspense, he said, is what happens when people stop using the net. Next story. When I was little, my grandmother could predict my cold before I even felt it. If I went outside without a scarf, she'd watch me like a detective and say, "You'll be sick by tomorrow." The next day, when I woke up sniffly, it felt like proof. Cold air had done it. Mystery solved. The older I got, the more the pattern started to crack. Some winters I froze my face off and stayed perfectly fine. Other times I barely stepped outside and still caught something that flattened me for a week. The real suspense was noticing that the sickness didn't follow the temperature. It followed people, crowded rooms, closed windows. That one coworker who just has allergies but keeps coughing. One winter, after a long day in icy weather, I stopped at a warm cafe packed with strangers. The heat fogged the windows, and everyone's breath hung in the air for a second before disappearing. 2 days later, half my office was sick. It was the kind of outbreak that makes you look back and replay your steps like a thriller, trying to pinpoint the moment you were exposed. The cold itself wasn't the culprit, but winter stacked the deck. Dry air that lets viruses linger, noses and sinuses that don't defend as well, people huddled indoors because the outside feels hostile. My grandmother wasn't wrong about timing. She was wrong about the cause. Now, when someone says the cold air will give you a cold, I still feel that old fear flicker. Then I remember the cafe. Warm, crowded, and quietly more dangerous than the snow. Next story. After one headline about a fight on the subway, my friend swore off public transportation forever. "It's not safe," she said, as if the train itself had a personality. The next morning, she got into her car like it was a protective shell, turned the key, and merged into traffic without a second thought. I rode the bus that day and watched the quiet theater of it. Tired people with headphones, a parent balancing a stroller, a student clutching a backpack. Nothing dramatic happened. The suspense was in my friend's voice, echoing in my head, making every passenger look suspicious for no reason. Later that week, we met for dinner. She arrived late, furious, not because she'd almost been hurt, but because traffic had been terrible. While she complained, her phone lit up with notifications. Another multi-car pileup on the highway we both use, serious injuries, lanes closed for hours. She barely reacted. "That's normal," she said. "That's just driving." That was the moment that stuck with me. We hear about a rare incident on transit and treat it like a warning sign for the entire system. We hear about constant car crashes and treat them like background noise, an inconvenience, not a danger. It's conditioning, the kind you don't notice until it's pointed out. A month later, she picked me up for a short trip. A driver ran a red light and we braked so hard my seatbelt snapped tight across my chest. No crash, no blood, no news story. Just a near miss swallowed by the flow of traffic. She laughed shakily and said, "See, this is why I like having control." I stared at the intersection and thought, control is the story we tell ourselves so we can keep getting in. Next story. At the public pool, the rule was treated like law. No swimming for 30 minutes after you eat. Parents shouted it from lounge chairs like a lifeguard command, and kids obeyed with the kind of grudging faith reserved for mysteries. The threat was always vague. Cramps, drowning, you'll sink. But the warning carried enough weight to turn a snack into suspense. One summer, I worked as a lifeguard and watched the pattern play out every day. A birthday party would show up with paper plates and greasy food. The kids would inhale everything like they'd been starved, then sprint toward the water, and a parent would yell, "Wait!" The kids would hover at the edge, bouncing on their toes, as if the pool were a magnet and the rule was the only thing holding them back. Then the real reason made itself known. It wasn't drowning from a magical stomach cramp. It was vomit. It was the way a heavy meal and frantic running can turn a kid's stomach into a timer. And it was always the same culprit. Hot dogs. I don't know why, but whenever a kid threw up, it was hot dogs. The moment it happened, the pool went silent for half a second before everyone reacted. Whistles, evacuations, chlorine, parents grabbing towels, kids crying because their fun got shut down. That's when you see why the myth survives. It's easier to scare children with a simple rule than to explain digestion and hygiene. Wait 30 minutes isn't science, it's crowd control. The next time I heard the warning, I didn't roll my eyes. I remembered the sudden hush, the swirl in the water, and the way an entire afternoon can end in one surprised gag. The suspense was never about drowning. It was about cleanup. Next story. The first night I stayed at my Korean friend's apartment, I reached for the remote and aimed the fan toward the bed. It was summer hot, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin. Before I could press the button, he sat up like I'd reached for a knife. "Don't," he said. His tone wasn't joking. I laughed, expecting a punchline. He was the smartest person in our group, a physics PhD candidate who could dismantle conspiracy theories with a whiteboard marker. But when it came to the fan, his confidence turned into something else, a practiced seriousness, like he'd had this conversation 100 times. He insisted we shouldn't sleep with it running, not because it sucks the oxygen out, he admitted. That version was nonsense. His explanation had evolved into a more elaborate story about disrupting the warm air around your body, cooling you too much, the risk of freezing in your sleep. He talked fast, animated, building a case as if he were defending a thesis. The more he spoke, the more unsettled I felt, not because I believed him, but because he did. That's the suspense of certain myths. They survive on tradition and emotion. I could see him holding two truths at once, what he knew scientifically and what he'd been told since childhood. He even admitted he didn't fully believe it, but he still didn't want to test it, so we compromised. The fan stayed on, but pointed at the wall, not the bed. I lay there sweating, listening to its hum, and realized the real fear wasn't the air. It was the story. Next story. The first time I saw the special gloves, I thought it was a joke. A box in the hospital supply room was labeled as safe for touching fentanyl, the way you might label gloves for chemicals or biohazards. It was meant to reassure, but it did the opposite. It made the myth look official. If we needed special gloves, then touching it must be deadly, right? That same week, a vial slipped from a coworker's hand and shattered. For a split second, everyone froze. Not because we were afraid of getting in trouble, but because the story we'd all heard outside the hospital flashed through our heads. Overdose by skin contact, instant collapse, danger like a movie. Then training kicked in. We cleaned, logged the loss, and moved on. No one fell. No one even felt lightheaded. The disconnect is where the suspense lives. People are terrified of the name, and the fear is convincing because the drug is potent in the right context. But potency doesn't mean magic. In our world, it's measured, administered with monitors and oxygen within reach. It's predictable, so predictable that the scariest part is how dramatic the outside narrative becomes. Later, I watched a viral video of a police officer overdosing after touching a bag, and it looked exactly like a panic attack, shaking, gasping, the body spiraling because the mind believes it's already doomed. The comments were a chorus of fear. Back at work, the glove box still sat there, trying to comfort people with a label that only fed the legend. I wished it said something simpler. Danger is real, but it's not contagious through a fingertip. What spreads fastest is the story. Next story. When my cousin went back to school for nursing, she was older than most of her classmates, and she carried one awkward secret. She'd never had the chickenpox vaccine. It wasn't a statement or a protest. It was just the kind of thing that happens when life runs ahead of medical schedules, and you don't realize what you missed until you're sitting in a lecture hall full of younger faces. In the middle of the semester, she caught chickenpox. The timing felt like a curse. Her classmates talked about it like a disease from another era, something you learn about, not something you live through. But there she was, itching, feverish, exhausted, trying to keep up with coursework while her body fought a virus everyone else had been protected from. What made it tense wasn't the rash. It was the environment. Nursing school means clinical rotations, vulnerable patients, strict rules. She had to report it immediately, isolate, notify instructors, and wait out the period where she could infect someone who couldn't afford that exposure. She told me it felt like watching dominoes. One overlooked detail in your own health history, and suddenly a whole schedule has to reorganize around you. When she finally returned, an instructor told her she might be one of the last people to go through the program with chickenpox at all because vaccination had changed the baseline. That thought landed heavy. It turned her miserable week into a marker of progress, proof that prevention is real even when you can't see it.